beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Today on Straight Talk Africa, a look at whether political protests, uprisings or revolutions are justified in changing dictatorships in Africa. That discussion is coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington. I am Shaka Ssali, and today we are discussing revolutions and political change. Also this month, we are celebrating the 19th anniversary of Straight Talk Africa. The first edition of the show was broadcast on August 2nd, 2000 from Washington. I would like to thank you, our audience, for your loyal support for all these years. Now, demonstrations led by young adults, the unemployed, professional organizations, and religious groups are now a driving force for political change across Africa. My colleague Paul Ndiho explains in this report.
Africa's political leaders are paying more attention to changes in their ranks due to popular uprisings, despite deadly crackdowns on pro-democracy protesters by government security services. In recent years, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, and Sudan have all witnessed major political changes due to sustained mass protests. After lengthy and difficult negotiations, Sudan's ruling military council and pro-democracy leaders signed a constitutional declaration on Sunday, paving the way for a transition to civilian rule after more than 7 months of demonstrations and violence. Under the agreement signed in the capital, Khartoum, a joint civilian-military ruling body will oversee the formation of a civilian government and parliament to govern for a 3-year transitional period, leading to democratic elections. Protest movement leader Ahmed Rabi signed the declaration at a ceremony attended by African Union and Ethiopian mediators. The declaration was the result of tense negotiations between the leaders of mass protests which erupted last December against 3-decade rule of President Omar al-Bashir and the generals who ousted him in April. Hundreds of people celebrated in the streets, dancing and chanting revolutionary songs, waving national flags and sounding horns. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, 95 years old, was forced to resign as president in November 2017. His resignation came a week after the army and his former political allies moved against him, ending decades of rule by a man who turned from independence hero to a typical strongman. Wild celebrations broke out in the capital Harare. People danced and cheered as they heard the news alongside members of the military. In the Gambia, a similar popular uprising in January 2017 triggered the exodus of longtime leader Yahya Jammeh after he refused to step down and hand over power to Adama Barrow, who had won the 2016 presidential election. Under Operation Restore Democracy, the Economic Community for West African States, or ECOWAS, decided to intervene militarily in the Gambia. The intervention ousted Jammeh, who had seized power in a 1994 coup and had vowed to rule the West African nation of 1.8 million people for 1 billion years. Before fleeing into exile in Equatorial Guinea, Jammeh ruled the Gambia with an iron fist, amassing unexplained wealth while the majority of the people lived in poverty. In his wake, Jammeh left a fleet of presidential planes and luxury cars. Now the government is looking to sell those items to raise millions of dollars for the country's health and education systems. In Burkina Faso 5 years ago, a popular revolt played out on the streets of the capital Ouagadougou as thousands of protesters and activists stormed the country's parliament as MPs prepared to vote to allow long-term ruling president Blaise Compaoré extend his 27-year rule. The mass demonstrations lasted 2 days and marked a turning point in the country's history, which ended with Compaore being ousted and forced to flee. He currently resides in exile in neighboring Ivory Coast, where he has become a citizen. Ivory Coast refuses to extradite him back to Burkina Faso. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. Joining me in the studio today is our distinguished guest, Niemat Ahmadi, President of the Darfur Women Action Group, and live via Skype from the South African city of gold, Johannesburg, I am joined by David Onserio Monda, Professor of Political Science at the City University of New York. I have to say, Niemat and David, that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you for having me, Shaka.
You're most welcome. Have you picked up some gold in Johannesburg?
I'm still working on it. I expected to see the streets lined with gold, but to my disappointment, I've not picked up any gold. I am, however, picking up quite a bit of Zulu and Xhosa. So hopefully I can teach you one or two words when I pass by Washington, D.C.
I can't wait for that. Let me come immediately to you, Niemat. Ideally, governments are supposed to be changed through the ballot, the ballot box. Any particular reason why, in many countries on the African continent, we need revolutions, we need uprisings, protests?
Well, Shaka, and this is a very important question for all of us to think of it, but it's obvious that in Africa, we have this norm that a leader, once they get on the seat of the ruling power, they never want to leave, and they want to stay there forever. People ask them several times, they play games, try to have election of their own, but they never allow a free and fair election for people to cast their votes through a fair ballot. So because of that, people are fed up. There is no way other than getting out to the street and demanding change. So unfortunately, that's the only way right now that remain in Africa, whereby people have to exercise their rights through going out to the street and demanding change. And Sudan is the best example you can see.
Very interesting. David, not only are you a panelist, but you are a professor of political science to boot. Any particular reason why most of Africa do not change or have the ability of changing governments through the ballot rather than through revolutions or uprisings?
I think there's several reasons for that. Part of it is the whole question of foreign powers that are able to support the regimes in power and not allow people's movements or revolutions to come, to the fore, to be able to come to fruition. The other question is the wider role of the institutionalization of institutions of government. In many of our African countries, the judicial and legislative arms of government usually tend to toe the line of the executive. So you have an emasculation of those second arms of government, the legislature and judiciary, to the executive. And thirdly, we have popular mobilization. In many of our African countries, the political space is really constrained by the executive, so it becomes very difficult for people to mobilize and to actually agitate for their rights. And then lastly is the health of the economy. In many of our African countries, you find the rentier state. In other words, the government relies on one major resource, whether it might be oil, like in Equatorial Guinea or Nigeria, or it might be gold or diamonds in Zimbabwe. And many of our leaders tend to use these resources to benefit themselves, and not only to do that, but also to crush the opposition by buying weapons from abroad and coercing opposition leaders or eliminating them with these resources. So there's a different range of reasons for that. Lastly, I must mention that Africa is a continent of many and diverse countries. So in terms of democratization and popular mobilization, some countries have a lot more space for that than others. So not all countries are the same in terms of this context.
I see. Niemat, David says among other things that it is really foreign interference. Foreign countries, foreign governments support local leaders or local rulers who support their interests. As a matter of fact, there is a Swahili word for that. It is called nyampara. They have their nyamparas on the African continent who obviously occupy State House and are called presidents. What about the people themselves? Are we talking about a people that are willing victims here? Or are we talking about a people who may not actually know their power? They may not be socially, politically conscious to the extent that they know they are in fact the primary stakeholders in their countries.
Well, what you said, I cannot agree more with you in terms of there are external influence and there are spoilers who are either like regional actors or international actors who who have an utmost interest in keeping the dictator in power so that the country can be weaker and it's easy to exploit the resources and also the circumstances of the people in the country. And in the case of Sudan, it was very true that the Sudanese people for the last 30 years, they did not realize their power. They were hoping that change will come. They're hoping for the government to step down or change through an election. They tried several times, but they were also, the government itself used the divide to conquer tactics and strategies to keep people divided. And then after a long standing crisis and so many problems that Sudan has multiple crises in different regions, and that has influenced the situation throughout the entire country. And then now the situation came into the level that it's intolerable everywhere. It's not just one region or two regions or three regions, but everywhere in Sudan. Then all of a sudden people start protesting, and it started very small in a small city, and then immediately spread out throughout the country. And then people now realize that they have that power, and they realize their power. But unfortunately, there are, as you said, the spoiler and outside interests which played, like when Sudanese mobilized, people came out and demanded change. People came out not in thousands, but in millions. And Sudan has not seen that kind of demonstration in the recent history. But then change became very real, and the hope was high. And unfortunately, all of a sudden, Bashir was forced out, and the military generals took on the role of facilitating keeping the country together until they can surrender the power to a civilian government, and people get to believe them, and everyone was happy that that process will happen. And all of a sudden, the regional actors, specifically the Gulf states led by Saudi government and the Emirates government, they came on board, and then Egypt, so they intervened. And what we have heard that they pledged a huge amount of money to these two military generals. And then they said they want a strong military in Sudan rather than a civilian government. Then all of a sudden the military, they already have the power in their hand. Now they have the weapon and they have the money. What else they need? So they realize that they can keep on, if they can keep the holding into power, and with weapon and everything, they can use delaying tactic, buy time, to make sure that they control whatever process that people want to see happening in Sudan, and that's exactly what happened right now with the recent agreement that we're going to talk about.
So when you talk about foreign powers, namely Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, obviously those countries felt that comfortable with the government in Khartoum that reflected their own conditions.
Yes, of course. They wanted to keep the government of the dictator, which was Omar al-Bashir regime, for years, so that because they felt very comfortable, the man can do everything for them to do. While the Sudanese people are starving, these governments are investing in Sudan in agriculture and exporting food to their countries, feeding their own people. And while they are fighting in Yemen, they kept their people safe, and Sudanese are sold out to be shipped to fight or get killed in Yemen. So you can tell and see clearly that the dictator, because the dictator has weakest relation with its own people, so they use the foreign interest to keep themselves in power, and that is exactly how this played into the situation in Sudan, that the government felt they are not desired by the people, and then now they have these spoilers and foreign interests investing in the negativity and the weakness of the regime to keep the regime in power as long as they can serve their interests and the interests of their people, while they're ignoring and overlooking and undermining the interest of the people of Sudan.
Niemat, talk to us a little bit about the spirit of Kandaka. What triggered Kandaka, the women power? What triggered it?
Well, to tell you the truth, women in Sudan, many people have a very different perception for women in Sudan because they have seen the way the government has portrayed women and the way women are treated during these last 30 years. But for me, as someone who's born and raised in Sudan and being a Sudanese woman, I know that Sudanese women are the strongest ever I have seen, and they have contributed in shaping the life of the Sudanese and the nation of Sudan throughout history, before even Sudan was not in existence as a political entity during the kingdoms, the kingdom of Darfur, the kingdom of Sennar, the Point Kingdom. And we come from the history of the Nubian kingdom, that where women are taking on the leadership of our society. And we actually come from a matriarchal family.
You have the warrior queens.
So we have those warrior queens, and that has not faded out, even though in the recent history of Sudan, Sudan have been a victim of foreign influence, but also foreign culture and cultural exploitation of the indigenous African in Sudan. So with Islam and Arabism, there is a new narrative that says a woman's place is at home, but that's not true. And the more you go out of the cities to the remote areas in the villages, you see how women are leading in a very soft way, but the women do everything. And these are the stories that we hear from our grandmothers, that during the fight when the colonial invaded the Sudan, and Darfur was the last territory to be colonized maybe in the African region and in the region. So the people of Darfur have mobilized. Every man who's capable of carrying a weapon were called out to fight against the colonial to defend their state. And women were left, they took on the role of leading their nation, taking care of all their society's affairs while taking care of their families. So they have these multiple roles. And until today, you will see that. And there is a strong Sudanese civil society movement right now throughout the years of the crisis in Darfur, in South Kordofan, the Blue Nile, and also these years of dictatorship in Sudan. women have been organizing, working in between their people and the government, protecting people's rights, educating people at the grassroots level, and going out even at international level. If you look today, those who are speaking on behalf of the people of Sudan, the overwhelming majority are women. So women have a strong voice, and also they do have understanding of an in-depth understanding of their own issues, their society issues, and they are not afraid and hesitant to stand up for themselves and for others. So that is simply what the Sudanese women are. And during this recent protest, you can see that it was very clear that in numbers, women are the most outspoken and the largest number of those who are mobilized and came out, and then they were leading the protest, and they were not afraid. This is stories of a woman who picked the tear gas that was fired, and she sent it back with his hand, and something like that. Like, no one has seen that recently, that someone would do that. That's not because of they are aggressive, but they believe in change, and they believe in life with dignity, and they believe that Sudanese people deserve better, and they wanted to show that they are not afraid to demand that change and work for it.
Very interesting. David, among other things, of course, Niemat points out that we have a situation where we have dictators here, and we have some of these processes that they go through holding elections. Some of them, in fact, say that they hold periodic elections and they stay in the State House precisely because they are popular. In fact, some of them go to the extent of saying that they don't even want to be there. They are there because people need them there, and therefore they are actually sacrificing. How do you respond to that?
Well,
no, I'm talking about David.
Sorry.
David.
Sure. Yeah, so I think, you know, to your point, this is definitely a major problem in terms of African leaders not wanting to give up power and actually subject themselves to the will of the people by actually allowing for elections. However, even when we have elections, we have what we call, you know, illiberal democracies, whereby we keep having elections, but those elections are a foregone conclusion. An example would be the case of Mugabe for many years in Zimbabwe, and the current case we have in countries like Uganda, where leaders consistently elected with 95 to 98% majorities, yet these elections are not transparent, free, and fair. And coming in relation to revolutions and popular movements that we've been speaking about, I think these are some of the challenges that our African countries face. Niemat was alluding to some of the challenges in Darfur, the rape and rape used as a weapon of war in areas like Darfur and during the Gukurahundi in Zimbabwe, in Matabeleland. Now, this is part of the problem in terms of why some of these leaders don't want to leave power, because they will be held to account for a lot of these genocidal practices, whether it's rape and human rights abuses, and whether it's in Zimbabwe and more closer to home in Sudan. al-Bashir and a lot of the generals have been indicted by the International Criminal Court. So in many cases, a lot of these regimes and the elites in these regimes are afraid that giving up power to the forces of democracy and popular movements and revolution will actually end them up being tried either at the International Criminal Court or being tried at home by whichever powers take over the reins of leadership once they leave power.
Now, David, you mentioned elections. What about some who actually say that that kind of process, in fact, is not an election, but a selection? They argue that it is a selection, especially because the incumbent president at that time is the kind of person, not only does he, in fact, organize the election, but in fact, he appoints the officials who conduct that election, who conduct the registration, and at the end of the day, who even count the votes?
I think this is a good idea. This is a good thought and a good point. But I think we also need to be careful not to compare all African countries as the same. So, for instance, you have some countries where elections have been contested, and the courts, like in Kenya, have turned down the election and actually stood up to the executive. That happened in Kenya during the past election. We have other countries where we have elections and they are essentially sham elections. So really, depending on the country, it's really a very different in terms of electoral experience. But I think by and large, for a lot of the leaders who've been in power for many years, these are not really elections, as you'd mentioned, but they are selections. And it then becomes a process whereby the only means through which people can have regime change is either through the president dying in office, where you then have a transition to somebody else, or by the military taking over power, either through a coup d'etat, which is directly called a coup d'etat, or what happened in Zimbabwe, where it was a coup d'etat, but the generals refused to call it exactly that.
Now, David, when again we talk about elections, some of these elections, which are organized, I would say, in the vast majority of the African countries. African countries, of course, they are about 54 African sovereign nations. And if you add Western Sahara, which obviously is not a sovereign state, there are 55 African Union member countries. Can you talk about more than 15 countries where, in fact, elections are held, and those elections are held for the benefit of the primary stakeholders, their citizens, rather than perhaps being held for development partners?
I think it becomes challenging. It's really difficult to even come up with 15 countries on the continent of Africa that would have free and fair elections. A lot of development partners are part of the problem because in many cases they tend to rubber stamp these elections and declare them free and fair when the reality on the ground is that they are not free and fair. In other words, the donors or the election observers really have other interests of major powers at heart. So this really becomes a challenge in terms of democratic transitions and then how to enforce these popular movements to allow the people's voices to be heard. So it's a real big challenge in terms of a continent. And also sort of piggybacking on what Niemat was mentioning, in terms of the transition in Sudan, I think we're at a very, very critical juncture there because there seems to be this tussle between the military junta, which decided to show al-Bashir the door, and a coalition of democracy activists who've been on the street and championing for democratic principles and democratic change. So we're really at a very delicate point, and it'll be interesting to see going forward whether the military will allow the forces of democracy, will allow the civilians to actually have the power of democracy and regular elections after this 18-month period. And whether we'll have another transition like what happened in Egypt, where you had a popular election and a democratically elected government, and then 2 or 3 or 4 years later, you have the habits of the military coming back and the military taking back power.
Very interesting. You are tuned into Straight Talk Africa. You're tuned into Straight Talk Africa. And we'll have more of a discussion in a moment, so please don't go away because we'll be right back with you.
Voices, we're talking about the news and issues you're talking about, sharing stories of development and growth across Africa,
around the world, and in our lives. Topics that inform, empower,
and change the rules.
It's time for Our Voices
With me, Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick,
and Hadiza Kiari,
and Ayan Bior,
and Orion Itangi Shaka. Join us on Facebook at VOA Our Voices.
It's time for Our Voices.
Today's youth are not just the next generation of African leaders, they are today's leaders. And this is the time to invest in them, today, not tomorrow. So let's connect, let's engage with each other on issues that will transform our societies. Innovation, leadership, entrepreneurship, things that you're doing to move the continent forward, to make you the greatest generation that Africa has known. It's Up Front every Wednesday, 1730 UTC, right here on the Voice of America.
We appreciate all of our audience feedback. Straight Talk Africa streams live every Wednesday on Facebook. Be sure to watch our show there and leave a comment. Now, let's look at what's on tap for next week's program.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, we'll have an in-depth discussion on child marriage and how girls are valued around the world. More than 600 million women alive today were married before the age of 18. Married teenage girls are often physically abused, and their lives of chores and childbearing perpetuate centuries-old cycles of gender inequality. The worth of a girl on the next Straight Talk Africa.
And today we are talking about uprisings and political change. In the studio today, we have Niemat Ahmadi, president of the Darfur Women Action Group, and David Onserio Monda, professor of political science at the City University of New York, who joins us via live Skype from Johannesburg, South Africa. Well, I have to say once again that Niemat and David, I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
And thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
You're most welcome, sir. Let me come to you immediately. Niemat, you come from Darfur. What is the reaction from Darfur? I don't hear much about them. Did they welcome the changes?
Well, unfortunately not. And the reason why is because of the reality on the ground. The realities in Darfur today is really dangerous. We have well over 3 million people who have been displaced since 2003. They have been in these makeshift camps for more than 16 years now. Not only that, they are still under attack. Humanitarian access is severely restricted. And on top of that, during this uprising, the people of Darfur were happy that now, at least like all Sudanese, felt the pain and they start protesting against what has been going on in Sudan. And they were hopeful that people from Darfur, they marched actually all the way, representative from internally displaced camps, women, young people, men, all different type of groups. They came all the way to Khartoum.
How far is that?
Over 15,000
kilometers. Really?
1,500.
They marched?
Yeah, 1,500 and maybe more. But they came, they traveled, they gathered, and they came down. They took lorries, the big trucks and buses. So whatever means that will take them there, they took, and they came. And they participated in the sit-in in front of the military headquarters in Khartoum. And they were sad but happy because they are sad because the people, the Sudanese, the overwhelming majority of Sudanese, when the genocide is happening and is still happening, they have never spoke for the people of Darfur. They have not stood beside them. They have not protested and asked the government to stop what has been going on in Darfur. But recently when the protests started, people realized that it wasn't about the people of Darfur, but this is a government that is killing its own people. So they were chanting, "We are all Darfur."
I see.
And the people of Darfur were so happy that now at least the plight of the people of Darfur is recognized by the entire Sudanese population, and that this revolution is going to bring change. Unfortunately, the recent negotiation and the agreement that has been reached has left Darfur out.
It is not inclusive, you mean?
It's not inclusive at all.
In what way?
In what way? First, those who have been negotiating are mainly from the center of Sudan.
They're from the center of Sudan?
Yeah, it's the same elite with different hats.
As a matter of fact, when you talk about that, in terms of optics, I have not also seen the presence of women.
No women. Women were doing the hard work. Come out, protest, organize people, bring food, bring water, all of that. And as soon as they start negotiating, they have excluded women. They have excluded the youth, who have been the backbone of this movement. And they have excluded the overwhelming majority of Sudanese, who are the historically excluded and marginalized Sudanese from Darfur, South Kordofan, the Blue Nile, Eastern Sudan, and name it. So when the agreement was reached, the agreement mentioned something about they are going to initiate peace negotiation to bring solution to Darfur. And the agreement in itself is a sham agreement, and it's shallow. It has not included strong grantees or any term of reference to which, if the parties disagreed on something or violated the agreement, what are the measures and mechanisms in place to hold them accountable? Who will guarantee this implementation? There was observers, international and regional, but the agreement was, to me, the first agreement that they announced it before this last agreement. It was like a memorandum of understanding.
Right.
And it's just a general narrative. They're speaking generally about all kinds of issues. And when it comes to women participation, they spoke about promoting women participation. No, there should be like a percentage of women participation, talking about the protection of rights of women. There's nothing about that.
They say that 40% of the cabinet is expected to be made up of women.
Not expected. There has to be a percentage that is stipulated by the agreement and agreed upon, and so that when this is a talk, like when you come to the reality, they will look around and say, well, we are expecting for women to fill this seat, but we can't find women. That's the talk that's always happening in Sudan. So when now the agreement has excluded the people of Darfur. So the people of Darfur felt not only left behind, but they are scared that the same process is going to be repeated. And
let's wait and see, because we do not
the
have
two generals. No,
we do not have the members of the Sovereign Council as yet.
Yes, but
they are going to be announced sometime, I think, on August 17th or 18th.
Let me tell you, it's obvious who's going to be in that Sovereign Council. We have two generals. When al-Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court for committing genocide in Darfur, he did not act it alone. These two generals were on the ground executing the process of committing genocide in Darfur. And until today, the Rapid Support Force led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo and Burhan was in central Darfur for years. He torched villages, ordered rape, and all kinds of atrocities that committed.
So what you are basically saying really is that
they are going to be part of the Sovereign Council. And the Sovereign Council is based on the agreement that The Sovereign Council include 5 civilians and 5 from to be nominated by the military council, the Transitional Military Council. And then the head of the sovereign will be nominated by the military. And the first part of the interim government, which is 21 months, is the largest and the longest part of the process, is given to the military general. So you can imagine. And then looking at the agreement has not included any accountability measures for the crimes committed against the people of Darfur and other people of Sudan in other areas, and in different times, even including during this recent uprising. They only mentioned one single incident, the massacre that happened on June 3rd.
Right.
So you will see that if you don't have that included in the agreement, how you are going to bring it later on with military being taking control of power and taking leadership and control of the first interim government. So
very interesting.
It's very dangerous. I think this agreement has set Sudan for failure.
Really?
Yes.
David, do you agree with Niemat from your vantage point? Because let's face it, we don't want to get a revolution turning sour or becoming a sort of frozen revolution like happened in Mexico in 1910 to the Mexican Revolution.
Yeah, I think I have a slightly different opinion in terms of the current negotiations. I mean, as Niemat has mentioned, Darfuris may not necessarily feel included within that process. But I think there's a very interesting and complex dynamic that's happening in Sudan right now. Let's not forget that Sudan lost 75% of its revenue when South Sudan seceded and became an independent state. And that revolution or that experiment in South Sudan has become a nightmare. So just because you have a revolution or you have a plebiscite that allows for a section of the country to become independent, that doesn't necessarily always end well, and South Sudan having a lot of problems. So I think the challenge in Khartoum and the fear in Khartoum is Darfur, if there was to be a free and fair plebiscite about whether they should stay as part of Sudan or secede, the fear in Khartoum is that Darfur will opt to be an independent state. As Niemat has mentioned, the repeated atrocities and genocide that's been going on there, that Colin Powell actually called a genocide, and the UN Security Council has called for indictment of the generals at the ICC. So it's a complex process, but I'm always an eternal optimist. I think negotiations are always better than violence and war. And if the democratic activists could actually find a way to include some of the Darfuris within the negotiating process, I think that would be a step forward. Because this endless conflict within the country is really not very helpful. It's happening in South Kordofan, it's happening in Darfur, and essentially a large part of it is tied to the rentier state, the oil resources that are in Darfur, the gold in Darfur, the oil in Abyei and Bentiu state. So these are all very challenging issues, and I think negotiation and power sharing in terms of the military and civilians will be a very important step going forward.
Now, David, how do you do that when Niemat and she has some supporters who actually characterize what happened recently in Khartoum as a change of guards as opposed to a fundamental change?
So this is a good point, and you know it's good to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because what is the alternative to you know, and in negotiations? You can't negotiate with Jesus Christ or with Muhammad. You can't negotiate with people that have not been there. In other words, you need a lot of these transitions. You have to deal with the individuals who've been on the ground and individuals who've been part of the Onserio regime, the former regime. You can't bring in new players from, you know, outer space. So it's not a perfect transition. It's not a perfect negotiation, but at least it's some form of a negotiation, which is better than perpetual violence and perpetual demonstrations. And going forward, I think if this standoff between the demonstrators and the military continues, what's actually going to happen is we're going to have a clampdown like what happened in Egypt, because Sudan historically has not had a democratic history. It's constantly been about military transitions or regime change through the military, whether it's from 1956 right until the ouster of al-Bashir. So
1953, as a matter of fact, 1953, when you think about the coup led by a young colonel called Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Yes. Yeah, yes, correct. And then in the case of Sudan, you had Idris's regime coming to power with the coup d'etat, and you had Numeri, and and he gets overthrown, and Sadiq al-Mahdi, and then you have al-Bashir. So and now al-Bashir has been overthrown. So the process or the years of Sudan's independence, whether it's when it was together with South Sudan or as an independent state, has been a very tortured one. There hasn't been a peaceful handover of power through the ballot box. And I think this is where the current negotiations, as Niemat mentioned, flawed as they are, is really important. It's a really important process for Sudan's future, for the country to decide, will we continue to opt for the military or strongman leadership, or will we have some form of transition where the people's voice can actually be heard?
Thank you. Well, you had it all, Niemat. Your fellow panelist, at the end of the day, seems to think that in the particular context of Sudan, as it is right now, you may in fact be forced to go with the army that you have, rather than the army that you wish you had.
It's been the challenge for years. The Sudanese people were told that you can't get what you want, and you can just agree with whatever people have to offer to you. But I disagree with that.
I see.
At least the basics. I know change is a process. It's not an overnight process. It takes time, but there are also basic for sustainable solution.
It is a process, not an incident.
Yes.
Or event, at least.
Yes. But when you are negotiating and having an agreement that will be served as the basis for stabilizing the country and bringing, it has to be inclusive, because the reason people protested, the reason Bashir was forced out, because the historical marginalization, exclusion. The government reached to a level that is killing some people and wiping them out. So the realities on the ground is governing whatever process you do. At least you have to have strategic framework that will show that you have the willingness of bringing all Sudanese together.
Yes,
people
indeed.
of Darfur are on the ground. They are not out of the country. So to tell me that, okay, we are inviting you later, I will understand and appreciate if they said, we include the people of Darfur who are currently on the ground with us, and then later on those who are opposition, who carry arms, we will sit down to negotiate to make sure that we bring everyone together and bring an end to war. So that will be understandable. But right now, as if the entire people of Darfur are out of the map, and then the people of Nuba Mountain and the Blue Nile, and then there are basics. So there are people who committed crimes. You can't tell me that a man who is responsible of atrocities will lead this country into peace.
You can be assured that we'll stay on this story, and in fact we'll come back
The problem is, even what happened on June 6th, that to me is the cost of immunity, because they saw that al-Bashir committed crimes, but he maintained the control over power to protect himself.
Unfortunately,
now, this is the military will think if they can maintain power, then they also can come protect themselves.
Unfortunately, Niemat, time again happens not to be our best ally, but you can also be sure that we'll continue watching the developments, and we'll come back after the Sovereign Council is formed, and then we will talk about where Sudan is headed.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
You're most welcome. Well, before we go, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the passing of American Nobel Prize winning author Toni Morrison, who died Monday night in New York. She was 88. Born in Rollin, Ohio, Morrison broke many barriers during her lifetime. In 1993, she became the first black woman to win a Nobel Prize in Literature for her novels. Morrison was best known for her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Beloved. In 2012, Morrison was awarded the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom by former President Barack Hussein Obama. On that, we're here at the Straight Talk Africa. Would like to send our condolences, and we definitely wish that her spirit rests in eternal peace. Let me come to you immediately, David. What is your reaction on the passing of this giant, someone, in fact, that has been characterized not only as a national, but in fact an international treasure?
I think I would characterize it in the context of what we currently have this month in South Africa, the Women's Month. You know, she was an incredible icon. And I would just like to say one of her famous quotes was, "It's not what you do, it's not about getting freedom, it's what you do with that freedom. How do you own that freedom?" And I think within the context of our discussion today of revolutions and people power, I think that's really extremely powerful. To what extent are we going to have popular movements agitate for freedom, and how will people be accountable for that freedom? I think this is one of her very powerful legacies.
Well, can you hear me, David? Because I don't hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Yes.
Yeah. What would be your reaction, David, if I told you that I have the honor and privilege of having, in fact, been in a classroom at the State University of New York in Albany, taught by the giant that we are saluting right now, reading a chapter in her probably first major novel, The Bluest Eyes. How do you react?
Well, I would say I wish I was in your position. I wish I was able to be taught by her. But I would challenge you to write. She encouraged people to write, to write, to write. Have an idea, write it, put it on paper. And hopefully we'll be seeing one of Shaka's memoirs coming out from all the years of your experiences with Straight Talk Africa and your lived experiences on the continent.
You may not believe it, David, but as we talk, the writing is in the process, and the working title, if you'd like to contribute to it, is in fact Defying the Odds, the story of the Cavalry Kid's journey from Cavalry to Washington, D.C.
I look forward to reading it.
Thank you very much. What about you? What do you think about Toni Morrison? She was a giant.
Well, I think she is the greatest of her time, and
her generation.
For us as African women, it is a great pride to know and learn from her, and I think her light will continue to shine forever. What she has contributed is not going to be limited by time or geographical boundaries, but it will enrich the whole world, not only here in the United States, not in the continent, but for the entire world. She has made the greatest contribution, and it is a lesson for us all. It's not about the freedom, but it is what you have to do with that freedom. I think if every single person took that, I think we will go really far in terms of our positive contribution to this world, and I hope we all can inspire by her and make sure that we contribute to the world and leave it better than how we found it.
Have you read any or some of her books?
Yes, I read Beloved.
Which one?
Beloved.
Beloved.
Yeah.
Beloved, you know, actually triggered a Hollywood movie.
Yes,
A
I haven't
Hollywood
been
movie
able to see the movie, but
in which Oprah Winfrey and Danny Glover, they were the major actors.
Yeah.
Beloved, I think, also probably was responsible for her winning the Nobel Prize for Literature and becoming the first female from any country, not simply in the United States, for actually getting that honor.
Prize. Yeah.
You know, you talked about how she probably is the best of her generation or her time and what have you. And there are actually some critics who say that you're looking at a lady, a great lady of all ages, for all ages really, in a sense.
Yes, I do believe she's for all ages and for all eras, not today, not tomorrow, but in our lifetime, her contribution will always be valid to every single time in our life.
Bruised eye, when she read the chapter in it, I sort of cried really, because it talks about a black child growing up through the struggles of living in a white-dominated nation. And by the way, she got her Bachelor of Arts degree from nearby here, Howard University, where she also eventually taught English. And later, of course, goes on to Cornell, the Ivy League in Ithaca, where she got herself a master's degree and all that. And like she said, she broke many barriers, including perhaps being the first black woman or man to be an editor at a major publishing house in New York, and guided so many people really to writing acclaimed books and what have you, interacted with people, among those who I regard as one of my heroines, the great Angela Davis. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she realized her power, but she was able to put it out.
Well, it looks like time is not our best ally. On that note, our guests today were Niemat Ahmadi and David Onserio Monda. Thanks to our audience for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, Sudan and Africa. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.